What would you do if you were wrongfully accused of the worst crime imaginable, only to find out 20 years later that the person you loved, who was supposed to be gone forever, was still alive? This is the chilling reality for one man, whose world came crashing down the night he was accused of murdering the woman he loved. His children abandoned him, and his life was destroyed, until, 2 decades later, he saw her again. Alive. But what followed would reveal a truth more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. His wife was found dead, and he was the prime suspect. Accused of her murder, his life spiraled out of control. But as the years passed, he could never shake the feeling that something wasn't right. What if she hadn't been the person he thought she was? What if she was alive, hiding in the shadows? And if she was, what had happened to his life in the meantime? As Nicholas Dawson stood in the airport terminal, he saw a woman, too familiar to be a coincidence. It was her, his wife, Amelia. But she had died 20 years ago. What would he do when he finally confronted her? How could she be alive, and what kind of twisted game had she played all these years? Nicholas Dawson was the embodiment of the all-American family man. He had a steady job as a contractor, where he worked long hours to provide for his family. Every morning, he kissed his wife, Amelia, goodbye and watched their 2 children, Jack and Lily, run off to school. It was routine, yet it felt meaningful. There was pride in the work he did, and he loved coming home to his family. Their home, a modest but warm house in the suburbs, was his sanctuary, his safe place. Nicholas wasn't just a husband. He was a protector, a father who spent weekends coaching little league games, helping with school projects, and making sure his kids never went to bed without hearing how much he loved them. Nicholas had always prided himself on being a man of integrity. His sense of duty and responsibility towards his family was unmatched. His wife, Amelia, had been his high school sweetheart, the woman he had built a life with. Their love story had never been a fairy tale, but it was real and it was theirs. Amelia had her quirks, her fiery side, but to Nicholas, she was everything. She made their house feel like home with her infectious laughter, her caring nature, and her unwavering support. She was his partner in every sense of the word. Whether it was raising their kids or navigating the challenges of life, they did it together. He couldn't imagine a future without her by his side. Their life wasn't without its struggles, of course. Like any couple, they had their disagreements. But those were small bumps in the road. Nicholas and Amelia had always found a way to work things out, until the night that would change everything. Amelia had a certain energy about her. She was outgoing, warm, and full of life. People gravitated to her. She was the kind of person who made you feel like you mattered. Her laugh could fill a room, and her kindness had the power to heal wounds that ran deep. To Nicholas, Amelia was the heart of their family. She had the ability to turn a simple dinner into a celebration and a regular day into an adventure. But she also had a side to her that Nicholas didn't fully understand. A part of her past that she kept hidden, something that had always lingered just out of reach, like a shadow waiting to resurface. For years, Nicholas didn't question her past. They were building a future together, and that was all that mattered. He had no reason to doubt her loyalty. But as their marriage grew, so did the distance. Slowly, Nicholas began to notice small, unsettling changes. Late nights at work, phone calls she'd quickly hang up on, a sudden wariness in her eyes when he asked her about the past. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as just stress or work pressures. But as the months passed, the cracks in their relationship began to show. Nicholas, ever the devoted husband, tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. But deep down, he knew. Amelia was pulling away. And it was only a matter of time before those old wounds, those secrets, would rise to the surface. At his core, Nicholas was a man who believed in family. He wasn't perfect, but he tried his hardest. His kids were the center of his world, Jack with his curiosity and energy, always asking questions, always pushing boundaries. And Lily, his sweet, caring daughter, who made him laugh with her innocence and boundless imagination. Nicholas had made a promise to himself when he became a father that he would always protect his children, that no matter what life threw at them, he would never let them feel alone. He wanted them to feel safe, loved, and supported, just as he had felt growing up. But as his marriage started to unravel, so did his sense of self. The man who once believed he could weather any storm now found himself adrift, unsure of who he could trust, unsure of where to turn. His role as a husband, a father, and a protector was being called into question. And then, the ultimate betrayal, being accused of his wife's murder, would shatter everything he had worked so hard to build. His family, once the source of his strength, became the very thing that tore him apart. In the blink of an eye, he was no longer a family man. He was a pariah, an accused murderer, stripped of his dignity, his past, and his future. Nicholas had once been a man who believed in the sanctity of family. Now, he was a man who had lost it all. And as the investigation into his wife's death unfolded, he would begin to realize that the most dangerous betrayal of all wasn't just the loss of Amelia. It was the loss of everything he thought he knew about the woman he had spent his life with. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, another night in the ordinary rhythm of family life. Nicholas had finished a long day of work and was looking forward to a quiet dinner with Amelia and the kids. But when he walked through the door, everything was wrong. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a chilling emptiness that felt wrong from the moment he stepped inside. The house, which was always warm and filled with laughter, was silent. Nicholas called out to Amelia, but there was no answer. The silence grew heavier. Panic crept up his spine as he moved through the house, searching. And then, in the bedroom, he found her. Amelia lay motionless on the floor, a pool of blood forming beneath her. Her once vibrant face was now pale and cold. The horror of the scene hit Nicholas like a wave. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. He rushed to her side, but it was too late. Amelia was gone. In a daze, Nicholas fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. The emergency operator's voice felt like a distant echo as he tried to explain what had happened. The police arrived within minutes, but it was clear that Amelia's death was no accident. There were signs of a struggle, and a deep stab wound was found in her chest, clear evidence that this wasn't a random act. Someone had wanted her dead. And as the police began their investigation, their eyes quickly turned to the one person who had the most motive: Nicholas. The investigation was quick, and the accusations came faster. The police found a trail of emotional tension between Nicholas and Amelia, a few arguments that, when viewed through the lens of suspicion, seemed to be the makings of a motive. Friends of Amelia, including her family, spoke about her recent unease, the growing distance in her marriage, and the small cracks in her relationship with Nicholas. It was enough to fuel the narrative of a troubled husband who finally snapped. The pieces began to fit too neatly. They found Nicholas's fingerprints on the knife that had killed Amelia, though he insisted that he had never touched it. And there was the matter of his alibi. His timeline didn't line up with the fire department's report of when they had received the first call about the incident. The police also discovered that Nicholas had recently taken out a large life insurance policy on Amelia, which, in their eyes, provided further motive. With everything stacked against him, it wasn't long before Nicholas found himself arrested, charged with the murder of the woman he had once called his partner. But the worst betrayal came not from the police or even Amelia's family. It came from his children. Jack and Lily, devastated by their mother's death, were unable to process the complexities of the case. The weight of their grief, combined with the relentless pressure from Amelia's family, led them to turn their backs on their father. His son, Jack, who once saw him as a hero, now refused to speak to him. His daughter, Lily, clung to her grandmother's side, listening to the lies and accusations that painted her father as a murderer. For Nicholas, it was a double-edged sword. Not only was he accused of taking the life of the woman he loved, but now, the two people who meant the most to him, his children, were no longer on his side. They saw him as the villain in a tragedy they couldn't comprehend. The betrayal from his family hit harder than any accusation ever could. How could his own children believe that he had murdered their mother? How could they turn away from him so completely? As the trial loomed, Nicholas's sense of isolation deepened. He sat in the cold confines of a holding cell, haunted by the memory of Amelia's lifeless body. Each day, he grappled with the disbelief that she was gone, and the growing fear that no one would believe him when he said he hadn't killed her. The world had already made its judgment, and the man who once held everything, his family, his career, his integrity, now found himself fighting for his very freedom against a system and a society that had already decided he was guilty. As the days dragged on, the weight of the legal battle bore down on Nicholas. The investigation into Amelia's death was swift, and soon, the public trial began. The courtroom was filled with onlookers, media, and spectators, all eager to watch what would unfold. To them, this was just another case. But to Nicholas, it was the unraveling of his entire life. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence: his past arguments with Amelia, the life insurance policy, the supposed motive tied to their troubled marriage. The pieces were put together with precision, and soon, Nicholas was being painted as a jealous, violent husband who had snapped. The fact that he had been at the house that night, the inconsistency of his alibi, and the discovery of the knife near his fingerprints were all used to solidify the narrative that he was the killer. Nicholas's defense lawyer fought hard to undermine the prosecution's claims. They dug into the lack of forensic evidence, pointing out that there was no direct proof linking him to the crime, and emphasizing that the knife could have been planted. But as the trial progressed, it became clearer that the truth didn't matter to the public. They had already made their judgment, and Nicholas felt the pressure mounting with every passing day. During the trial, the emotional weight of the proceedings became too much for Nicholas. He had hoped that the truth would come out, but it was being twisted and distorted. His defense team presented evidence that suggested Amelia's death was part of a larger, darker story, one involving betrayal, deception, and manipulation. But none of that seemed to matter when the media had already decided he was guilty. The public opinion turned against him rapidly. He became the subject of gossip, the villain in a tragic story. Everywhere he went, people whispered. His co-workers, once friendly, began avoiding him. In the grocery store, he felt the stares of strangers, judging him for a crime he didn't commit. The isolation began to eat away at him. He was a man trapped in a world that had already condemned him, even though the evidence couldn't prove his guilt. His trial didn't help. The jury deliberated for hours before reaching a verdict. The verdict came down swiftly: guilty. It was the culmination of months of anguish, the result of a broken system, where the victim's family and the media's portrayal of Nicholas left little room for doubt. His life was shattered. The man who had once been a loving husband and father was now a convicted killer. The sentence was a harsh one: life imprisonment. The world saw him as a murderer, and the damage to his reputation and his soul was irreparable. The most painful part of the aftermath wasn't the legal punishment, it was the emotional toll. His children, Jack and Lily, were torn apart by the accusations. They were manipulated into believing that their father was responsible for their mother's death. The visits became less frequent. They didn't call, didn't write. The distance between them grew wider with every passing day. He tried to reach out, tried to explain to them that he hadn't killed Amelia, but they refused to listen. His children had been fed lies, and it was too late to change their minds. The betrayal of his own flesh and blood was the hardest thing to bear. Nicholas had been a father who lived for his children, and now, those very children would never believe in his innocence. They saw him as a murderer, and no words could ever undo that perception. The scars of that emotional abandonment would remain with him forever. Nicholas's life after the trial was one of painful isolation. The world had turned its back on him. Friends he had known for years stopped calling, stopped visiting. The prison walls were no longer just physical, they were emotional, too. He had become a ghost in his own life. Even in the rare moments when he left prison for a short time, he was met with cold stares and whispers. His reputation as a murderer followed him like a dark cloud. The pain of the separation from his children was like a constant ache. He knew they had been manipulated, but the distance between them was unbridgeable. It was as though he had lost them forever. Every day, he wondered if they would ever come back to him, if they would ever understand the truth. But he couldn't wait for them to come around. He couldn't afford to live in a world of hope that had been crushed time and again. Nicholas spent his days in solitude, his mind trapped in a never-ending cycle of memories and regret. He couldn't escape the image of Amelia's lifeless body. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he had been part of a scheme he didn't understand, no matter how much he tried to prove his innocence. Slowly, Nicholas found a way to rebuild a semblance of life, though it would never be the same. He took odd jobs in the prison's industrial yard, worked in the library, did what he could to keep his mind occupied. But nothing could replace the feeling of having a family. The absence of his children, the loss of his wife, the absence of the life he had worked so hard to build. These were the things he carried with him. Years passed, and Nicholas made small attempts at starting over in whatever capacity he could. He reached out to his children again, but the responses were cold. They had grown up in a world where their father's name was synonymous with murder. They had their own families now. The pain of not being a part of their lives was unbearable. But Nicholas kept moving forward. He built new relationships with people who didn't know his past. He tried to fill the void with new work, new faces. It wasn't the same, but it was a life. A life without his children, without the woman he loved, but a life nonetheless. Despite the efforts to rebuild, there was one thing that never left Nicholas: the unanswered question. Was Amelia really dead? Or had she faked her death? The guilt of not knowing the full truth gnawed at him, eating away at his soul. If she had really faked her death, what was her motive? Why had she done it? What had happened to their life together? He never got the chance to ask her these questions. He never got the chance to confront her. That silent pain, that lingering uncertainty, was the one thing he couldn't escape. And it haunted him every day. As he continued to live in the shadows of his past, he began to wonder, would he ever find peace? Would he ever uncover the truth about what happened to Amelia? Would he ever find a way to reunite with his children? Or was he forever condemned to be a ghost of a man who had been lost in a web of lies? 2 decades had passed since that fateful night, the night when his world fell apart, and his wife, Amelia, was torn from him in the most brutal way possible. 4 years, Nicholas lived with the scars, the painful isolation, and the unanswered questions that had haunted him since that day. The question of whether Amelia was truly gone had never left him. He had resigned himself to the idea that he would never know the truth, that he would have to live with the shadow of that uncertainty hanging over him forever. Then, one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary day, just like the countless other days he had spent in the shadow of his past. Nicholas had taken a walk through the city, trying to clear his mind. He was lost in his thoughts, reflecting on the years that had slipped by, when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. The woman standing across the street was nothing more than a passing figure, but there was something about her, something that made his heart stop. The resemblance was uncanny. It couldn't be. Amelia had died 20 years ago. He had seen her body, the autopsy report, the funeral. She was gone. But as Nicholas stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. The woman looked exactly like her. The same posture, the same eyes. Everything about her screamed Amelia. For a moment, time stood still. Was this real? Could this really be her? Nicholas hesitated, his mind racing with disbelief and confusion. He was almost afraid to approach her, afraid that the truth, whatever it might be, would break him once again. But there was no way he could walk away now. He had to know. His pursuit of the woman didn't take long. He found her sitting in a cafe a few blocks away, looking out of the window, seemingly unaware of the man standing just behind her. With each step closer, Nicholas's heart beat faster. His stomach churned with a cocktail of emotions: anger, disbelief, hope, and dread. He approached cautiously, his voice shaky as he called out her name. Amelia! The woman turned around, her face a mix of surprise and something else. Something he couldn't quite read. She stood frozen, and for a brief moment, Nicholas thought he might be hallucinating. But then slowly she stood up, her eyes welling with unshed tears. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Nicholas!" The world seemed to tilt beneath him. How could this be? Amelia was alive. She had faked her own death, left him to rot in prison for a crime he didn't commit. All these years, all the pain he had endured, had been for nothing. She explained, her voice barely above a whisper, that she had staged her death. She had faked it all, her murder, her funeral, the entire charade. She had left him to bear the weight of her lies because she had wanted to escape. She wanted to start over. Amelia had grown desperate, terrified of facing her past, and in the process, she had destroyed his life. The life they had built together. But why? Why had she done this to him? The answer was a tangled web of fear, selfishness, and manipulation. Amelia had been running from something in her past, something that terrified her, And instead of confronting it, she had chosen to escape in the most dramatic way possible, by faking her death. She had used him as the scapegoat, leaving him to carry the burden of a crime he never committed. Nicholas stood there, unable to process the full weight of the revelation. The woman he had loved, had trusted, had just admitted to destroying everything he had ever known. She had stolen 20 years of his life, his relationship with his children, his dignity, his peace. And for what? Nicholas demanded the truth. He needed to know everything. How had she planned this? Why had she involved her family? Why had she let him suffer in a prison of lies for all these years? Amelia's face was ashen as she spoke. Her guilt was palpable, but her motivations were equally complex. She had been driven by fear of her own demons, and by a twisted desire to escape the life she had with him. She admitted to manipulating him, to convincing him of her love, knowing full well she would betray him when it suited her. She had left him behind, and now, 20 years later, he stood before her, a man broken by her deception. Nicholas's mind reeled as the truth sank in. Every moment he had spent in agony, every second of doubt, every tear he had shed, had all been for nothing. It was all a lie. Amelia had faked her death, and he had been the one left to pay the price. The years of imprisonment, the loss of his children, the abandonment by friends and family, everything had been orchestrated by the woman he had once called his partner. The emotional fallout was profound. Nicholas was overwhelmed by a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any wound he had ever felt. This wasn't just the betrayal of a marriage, it was the betrayal of a life. A life that had been stolen from him. The rage he felt was almost suffocating, a storm inside him that threatened to swallow him whole. And yet, in the midst of his fury, there was a deep sorrow, a grief for the life he had lost, for the family he would never get back, for the years that could never be reclaimed. The truth, when it came to light, tore apart the fragile foundation of Nicholas's relationship with his children. Jack and Lily, now adults, were faced with a cruel reality. Their mother, the woman they had believed to be their hero, had been the mastermind behind the deception that had ruined their lives. The pain of that discovery was too much for them to bear. Jack, who had once been so close to Nicholas, found himself torn between his mother's lies and his father's innocence. Lily, still young at heart, struggled with the shattered image of the woman she had idolized. They were devastated. How could they ever forgive Amelia for everything she had done? How could they ever reconcile with their father, the man who had been accused of killing their mother? Nicholas, meanwhile, found himself at a crossroads. He had lost his children once to the lies, and now he faced the harsh reality that they might never come back. His role as a father, as a protector, had been taken from him not just by his wife's betrayal, but by the aftermath of the lie that had consumed their family. He was forced to reckon with the devastating truth that no matter what he did now, some wounds were too deep to heal. Nicholas faced the most difficult decision of his life. Should he seek revenge on Amelia for everything she had stolen from him, or should he somehow find a way to move on, to forgive, and to rebuild his life again? The anger he felt was palpable. He had been wronged in ways that no one could fully understand. But revenge would not bring back the years lost, nor would it heal the broken relationships with his children. Revenge, he realized, would only keep him tied to the past. In the end, Nicholas chose a path of quiet redemption. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could still choose how to move forward. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like walking through fire, but he began to rebuild. He reached out to Jack and Lily once again, not with anger, but with an open heart, hoping they would one day understand the truth. And slowly, in the silence of the years that followed, Nicholas began to find peace. For Nicholas, the road to healing would never be simple. The scars of betrayal would always remain, and the damage to his family could never be fully repaired. But in the end, he found something that had eluded him for so long: peace. It wasn't the peace of justice, nor was it the peace of reconciliation with his children. It was the quiet acceptance that, despite the horrors he had endured, he could still walk through life with his head held high, knowing that he had survived. The legacy of Nicholas's story wasn't one of revenge, it was one of survival. And for the first time in 2 decades, Nicholas could finally breathe again, knowing that he had reclaimed his life from the darkness. As the years went by, Nicholas Dawson's name became a symbol of lost time and stolen dreams. The world had painted him as a murderer, a man responsible for his wife's tragic death. And yet the greatest tragedy of all was the betrayal that had shattered his life long before the truth ever came to light. For 2 decades, he fought to prove his innocence, only to find that the real enemy wasn't just the justice system. It was the woman he had loved and trusted, who had orchestrated a lie so massive that it consumed his entire existence. The pain of losing Amelia, the anguish of being torn from his children, and the suffocating isolation that followed were wounds that would never fully heal. Yet in the face of all this, Nicholas found something unexpected: peace. It wasn't a peace born of revenge or justice. It wasn't a peace that came from the truth being revealed. It was a quiet, hard-earned peace that arose from forgiving himself and accepting the things he could never change. For Nicholas, redemption was not about finding closure with the people who had turned their backs on him. It was about reclaiming his life, even if it meant living with the scars of the past. He learned that sometimes the hardest battles are not with others, but with oneself. He had survived the storm, but the calm that followed was one he would have to navigate alone. As for Amelia, her fate was sealed by the consequences of her actions. Her lies, her manipulations, and the years she spent hiding in the shadows, never truly facing the devastation she had caused. But for Nicholas, her betrayal was just one chapter in a life that had been rewritten in the wake of loss. And what about the children? Jack and Lily, now grown, faced their own battles with the truth. They had to confront the painful reality that the mother they had once idolized was not the woman they had thought her to be. The weight of that knowledge would shape their lives, just as it had shaped Nicholas's. In the end, Nicholas was left with one fundamental truth: life goes on, even after it has been broken beyond recognition. And sometimes, the only thing you can do is take each step forward, no matter how heavy the weight of the past might feel. What is justice when everything you thought you knew has already been lost? When the ones you loved most have betrayed you, and your whole world has been torn apart? For Nicholas, the answer was simple: survival. And sometimes, that's all we can hope for. What would you have done if you were in Nicholas's shoes? Would you have sought revenge, or would you have tried to rebuild your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more true crime stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew.